are generally a time when studios drop their Oscar bait films. Now, what makes something Oscar bait is fairly subjective, so I'll just say for me, it's about films that would in one way or another flatter the Academy by being selected. Brave performances and or issue films that flatter a sense of moral fortitude in the prestigious club are among my least favorite. And because going to the movies was a Christmas night tradition for me, I have a long history of picking some truly awful movies to watch on Christmas. The list includes Castaway, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, A Beautiful Mind, and 7 Pounds, all of which I would put in the category of Oscar bait. Some of them panned out. And if you want to argue that those movies are good, actually, feel free to start your own channel. But for me, there's a bleak sentimentality to these films that may get you awards recognition, but it's a combination that I find personally insufferable. Now, add to that cocktail the political self-righteousness of, I will fight for someone I don't know, and you've got Don't Look Up. Don't Look Up is the brainchild of journalist turned Bernie Sanders campaign manager and famous Twitter troll David Sirota, and SNL writer turned raunchy comedy director turned political comedy director Adam McKay. McKay, after the prestige he earned from his award show darlings The Big Short and Vice, brought together a massive cast of Oscar winners to star in this political satire. The movie is a broad allegory for the way our communication structures and institutions of power fail to address the existential threat of climate change. Sort of. See, the production schedule was interrupted by the pandemic, and so somewhere along the way they decided to layer in critique of the way our media ecosystem has handled COVID, and things get messy enough that a number of reviews don't even mention climate change. Now, quick recap if you haven't seen it. Michigan State PhD candidate Kate Dibiaski discovers a comet, and her professor, Dr. Randall Mindy, calculates its path to discover it's going to collide with Earth in precisely 6 months and 14 days. They call NASA and get flown to DC, where they wait to talk with the president, and Kate throws up. Opening credits roll. The president rebuffs them because of electoral concerns. They go to a newspaper and on a cable news show and fail to get anyone to take them seriously. Then the president decides to take action because of electoral concerns. Then a tech billionaire derails the launch by coming up with a plan to get rich off of the comet. Then the meteor gets close enough that people can see it, and the astronomers head a social media campaign to get people to, quote, just look up. The president polarizes the issue with the titular slogan, Don't Look Up, the tech billionaire's plans fail, and Earth is destroyed. The end. Oh, and there's an epilogue where the tech billionaire's escape ship lands on a distant planet 22,740 years in the future, and the president gets eaten by an alien. Oh, and then there's an end credit sequence where the president's son survives the apocalypse somehow and shouts out to the internet that he's the last man on Earth. Like and subscribe. The end for real this time. Now, as you may have noticed, the plot takes its structural DNA from the apocalyptic movies of the late 90s, early aughts, but asks the question, what if a comet was headed to Earth and nobody cared? What if the president only cared about her poll numbers? What if the news media only cared about being light and entertaining? What if social media only cared about who was hot and who was crazy? What if a tech billionaire decided it would be worth risking the fate of the planet to profit off of the minerals in the comet? What if the president agreed? And what if it failed and we all died? Now, I realize that when I describe it like that, it sounds pretty okay. Like, I too am deeply enraged by political cowardice and inaction, the spectacle of cable news media, the self-reflexive nature of online discourse, and, oh, yeah, the constant exploitative drive of capitalism.
Like and subscribe.
I too find all of these things frankly obscene when facing the giant specter of climate change. Politically, I agree with the premise of this film. I still hated it. Because while it is ostensibly a political satire about climate change and the systemic hurdles of actually tackling the issue and preventing apocalyptic disaster, ultimately it succeeds only in perpetuating many of the things it's trying to critique. And I think it's worth talking about that for a bit. One, because it did get nominated for 4 Academy Awards. And 2, because I do think climate change is an existential threat to humanity that needs to be tackled. I just don't think liking or not liking this movie has any bearing on that stark reality. But first, since this is a critique of satire, which is itself a critique of social mores, I want to be clear about what I mean when I say it's bad satire. Basically, what I mean by that is quite simply that it's poorly observed. Comic exaggeration and simplification are always going to be a part of satire, but the portrait that emerges should still be recognizable as the subject. It's like if you went to a caricature artist and their Jay Leno had a normal-sized chin or something. So yeah, none of what follows is coming from the standpoint that it's not in-world believable, that it's a plot hole or an extreme caricature that has no basis in reality. Rather, it's an overarching critique of the critique. Are the problems of society regarding the question of climate change well observed? So yeah, I didn't like this movie. Now, I don't think that makes me a better person than anyone who did, but the movie thinks that me not liking it makes me a bad person. And that's a truly obnoxious attitude to sit through for 145 minutes. It's the type of communicative posturing that turns the passive experience of not liking something into the active experience of hating it. Like, how fun is it to be repeatedly told you suck from a narrative work that consistently misrepresents your position and conflates it with the position of people you generally despise? And through the movie's lens, this isn't the fault of bad filmmaking, it's my fault for being unable to focus on the message. But that's one of the fundamental problems with it. It consistently exhibits a deep disdain for the art of effective communication, which, ironic. And to a certain extent, I get it, like in the face of extreme trauma, in this case, a life-ending comet, the struggles of effective communication feel obscene, and not everyone is equipped with the tools or has the disposition to communicate through trauma in the way that could spur action, nor should they be expected to. But that doesn't mean that the practice is to be wholly shunned or derided. The movie makes it seem like it is, though, because it only ever offers us two options: scream the hard truth about how we're all gonna die, or play footsie with media personalities trying to turn the end of the world into a cute puff piece. This false binary is first presented in the TV appearance with both Kate and Dr. Mindy on the pop news show The Daily Rip. And here I'll just stop to point out that for supposedly being a skewering of media, the film's media world building is pathetically shallow. There are only two outlets that are even remotely fleshed out: the New York Herald, a stand-in for the New York Times, and the Daily Rip, an apolitical talk show a la Morning Joe. Everything else, a Fox News stand-in whose name I forget because who cares, a BuzzFeed TMZ stand-in where Kate's shitty boyfriend works, a Sesame Street stand-in, and some science magazine, and the two social media platforms of Vroom Vroom, basically Twitter, and MeTube. Guess what that's an avatar for? They're all shown in montages that zoom past in a series of one-off jokes about as sophisticated as a Family Guy "Hey, I recognize that pop culture reference" bit. That's it. Any avenue for actually presenting complex information to the public simply doesn't exist. There is only one newspaper for them to go to, and that newspaper sends them to the only news program that would possibly host them. Indie book publishers have more thorough media campaigns. And as far as the social media critique goes, we are in full-blown OK Boomer territory. There are no threads, no takes, just OMG good, OMG bad. And we're supposed to believe that these posts from no-name accounts are receiving hundreds, nay, thousands of interactions after just 3 minutes? I mean, it really reads like your parents' horrible imagined version of what the internet is. But fine, whatever. We're on the show, and Dr. Mindy is getting sidetracked by the relentless banter, and Kate flips out and screams that we're all gonna die. He gets invited back, she doesn't. Now, offered these two choices, we are supposed to side with the hard truth tactic, in part because it's not presented as a tactic at all. It's an outpouring of grief and terror and fury, and the only way that we're shown that the media responds to it is by turning Kate into a meme of demented doomsday paranoia, which is certainly a believable media response, but it's not the only one. I mean, if we take this out of the realm of the metaphor of the film, we have a prime example of speaking the harsh truths about climate change in Greta Thunberg. Certainly, there are some media outlets and their online followers that warp Thunberg's dire warnings and condemnations into jokes about her mental state. But there are also many mechanisms by which her truth-telling is co-opted into platitudes of inspiration, almost as if the vast majority of people would rather deify her as a Cassandra figure than take any form of action that would make her crusade end. Now, if the film were honestly trying to critique the many ways in which our communication structures turn almost any call to action into an Ouroboros of discourse, we would get some version of Kate's hard truth rant being absorbed and anesthetized in this way. But as Dr. Oglethorpe, one of the most offensively tokenized characters in the film, says later,
"A man's always got choices, Randall. Sometimes you just gotta choose the good one."
Just choose the good choice.
Choose the good choice.
This script got nominated for an Oscar. The good one, in this case, being screaming that we're all gonna die. Fully satirizing the way that social media commodifies even the most earnest pleas for action would mean showing how the good choice can be equally ineffectual. But that would be too bleak, wouldn't it? Gotta keep things upbeat in order to be entertaining, am I right? Now, we do eventually arrive at something like this, but the filmmakers don't portray it as a negative. More on that later. So the two astronomers go back to the newspaper where they're shown the social media responses. Kate's crazy, Dr. Mindy's hot, scolded for not being 100% on the science. Side note, the way this movie goes back and forth on the 100% certainty thing is weird and frankly anti-science. And the story is abandoned and they're sent home. We will never hear from the New York Herald again. And now we're in inexplicable montage territory, which is where I'm going to stop and point out the insane levels of Americacentrism in this movie about a global apocalypse. Now, this isn't new to the disaster movie genre. Deep Impact is probably the most egregious example, but Armageddon and The Day After Tomorrow are also pretty bad. At least Armageddon has some level of international cooperation in it, and now I'm defending Armageddon, so that's fun. Whatever. The montages in Don't Look Up are basically the only places where we get any indication that the rest of the world even exists. And it's about as representative as flipping through some old National Geographic magazines. It's not until 2/3 of the way through the film that we even hear about the UN in a soundbite that goes absolutely nowhere. Later still, the backup plan, devised and coordinated by Russia, India, and China, is introduced in the same line of dialogue that informs us that it's failed. And these pathetic nods to a world outside the US only happen in response to US failures. No other nations have agency or proactively move in self-interest. No other media networks outside the US exist. No other populace has scientists or activists that are working on this problem, which is why our main characters have to hold a pop concert to plead for those nations to act. Like, it's gross. Also, on the subject of montages, this movie was nominated for Best Editing, which... yeah. So the editing in this film is unbelievably atrocious. They tried to do something similar to the editing in The Big Short, intersplicing a bunch of discordant shots, making montages out of singular scenes, but it just doesn't work here. The most disorienting montage sequence is when they cut back and forth between the president describing her speech, the speech itself, and people across the globe watching the speech. It feels like neither scene could stand on its own, and so they just mash them together in a way that's so jarring and off-putting that it's just bizarre. And add to that, this moment in the final dinner scene...
If I'm to be completely honest, which at this moment, why not? I actually like the junky taste of store-bought better than homemade.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me.
If I'm to be completely honest, which at this moment, why not? I actually like the junky taste of store-bought better than homemade. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. No. I'm not kidding.
So, I can't believe that I'm this far into this critique and I haven't even mentioned the president yet. I'm just gonna put my cards on the table here and say this movie hates women. Like, hates. Aggressively. It's a lot. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, and I'm not going to defend President Orlean as a character because she sucks. If she were a person, she'd be an awful person, and I would intensely dislike her. But she's not a person. She's a character, devised and written by men, basically as a means of demonstrating that Hillary would, in fact, have been just as bad as Trump, and this is what you identity politics people deserve for saying that representation matters. It's as cynical and belittling a move as John McCain picking Sarah Palin as his running mate. Also, the both sidesism is pretty blatant too. As her political affiliation is never mentioned, she switches back and forth between red and blue suits, and we're first introduced to her with the camera cutting to photos of her with Steven Seagal, Mariah Carey, and Bill Clinton, while also showing her office decorated with portraits of Andrew Jackson and Richard Nixon. Oh, and in that first scene, she tells a story about not wanting to be seen smoking on the campaign trail, which is a direct reference to Obama. I mean, who is this woman? A dumb, greedy, vapid slut. That's who. I mean, her motivations are greed and lust. Her political scandal involves some truly excellent jokes about the pussy pics she sends looking like an armpit and the chin of a man with a strange beard. She follows the tech billionaire around like an obedient puppy. Even her son objectifies her in a moment clearly meant to recall Trump openly lusting after his daughter because the sexual politics and the power dynamics of those two things are completely equal. They even abandon any real critique they have of the inevitable failure of the tech billionaire's delusions of grandeur in order to have the final joke be about her getting her stupid face eaten by an alien. Lols. So yeah, dumb, greedy, vapid slut. And Cate Blanchett is a smart, greedy, vapid slut. And Dr. Mindy's wife is the long-suffering spouse who never leaves the house and only exists to be abused and then serve as the vessel for her husband's moral absolution. And Kate is the cool girl feminist that the filmmakers can point to say nuh-uh when anyone gets offended by any of this. She's the hero after all. Except she's not. She has no direction or purpose without Dr. Mindy. Her family only exists to make a single dumb joke, and she only finds motivation again through the introduction of a male love interest. It sucks. It all sucks. I hate it. Oh, and the POC characters also get treated terribly, with the sole exception of Dr. Oglethorpe. They're all part of the problem, and Dr. Oglethorpe himself, the head of the Planetary Defense Coordination Office at NASA, whose real-life existence is treated as a joke even though the premise of the movie demonstrates its use, ceases to have a job, authority, subordinates, friends, or family once Dr. Mindy enters the picture. Like, the idea that this man wants to spend his last night on Earth eating unseasoned food in Michigan is frankly baffling. But then he has to be there so that he can simultaneously not offer to say a prayer while also having the church bona fides to give Timothée Chalamet the okay.
Amen.
Amen. Wow, you's got some church game.
But moving on, let's get into the tech billionaire bullshit. Peter Isherwell is the Bezos, Gates, Jobs, Musk, Zuckerberg mashup that nobody asked for. He's well played by Mark Rylance. Honestly, the acting in this movie is the best thing about it. Good job all around. And the capitalist tech utopia vision that drives these moguls is probably the most accurately lampooned target in the whole film. But as I stated previously, the accuracy of the critique is abandoned for the sake of a dumb sexist joke at the end.
They scale.
That's disgusting.
What is that thing? I believe that's called a brontorod.
Okay, he claims to, through social media data harvesting, know so much about a person as to be able to predict the time and manner of their death. Now, that's a fine satirical exaggeration of the kinds of boastful claims tech entrepreneurs make about their algorithms all the time. The catch, as we've all come to experience it again and again, is that algorithms are only as good as the inputs they get. They are as flawed as the humans who program them and the humans who feed them data. And Isherwell's grim prediction of Dr. Mindy's death...
Your death was so unremarkable and boring. I can't remember the details, apart from one thing. You're gonna die alone.
doesn't come to pass. However, his prediction that President Orlean will die by being eaten by a creature that has yet to be discovered by man...
I don't think I want to know. Yes, I do. I want to know.
You're gonna be eaten by a brontorod. We don't know what it means.
A what?
A Bronterock.
A prediction that has no possible mechanism for input does. So what are we to do with this? Is Isherwell right about his all-knowing power? Was he only thwarted by Dr. Mindy changing his ways and choosing the good choice? Because if so, and I feel like that's the only way to read it, then the movie buys into his delusions, and it's not a critique. Likewise, the critique of his space exploration aspirations is also neutered by the ending. His mining mission on the comet fails spectacularly, which we are to view as hubris. However, the much more sci-fi proposition of cryogenically freezing a bunch of elites, sending them on a big space ark headed into the void that will find a habitable planet in 22,740 years, and everyone will awaken and human life will continue, that he can do. And I'm sorry, but given the unbelievable scientific hurdles involved in that enterprise, the toss-off line about how only 50 or so % of the subjects died is impressive, not damning. And all of this just so we can have naked Meryl Streep getting her face eaten by an alien. There's also a layer of mental health mockery in Isherwell's story that wouldn't be so much of a problem if it weren't carried through the rest of the movie. His character is introduced in a product launch presentation where he announces that your phone will now be able to sense when you feel negative emotions and immediately offer you anodynes in the form of cute animal videos, along with scheduling appointments for mental health services to, quote, make sure that bad feelings never return. Which is certainly an aspect to the tech utopia vision, and it's certainly a way in which some people treat mental health services. But it's not treated by the rest of the film as a gross mischaracterization of those services. Therapy and medication are treated throughout the film as methods of, quote, running toward pleasure and away from pain.
Like a field mouse.
In a word, they're cowardly. And this gets back to the idea of communicating through trauma, because if the filmmakers had any respect for mental health services, they would know that admitting to, accepting, and giving voice to negative emotions is a huge part of therapy. And in dealing with trauma in particular, something that is primarily a response to an experience of utter powerlessness, the most therapeutic thing that you can do is to find ways to reclaim your power and your sense of agency. In other words, to act.
Like a field mouse.
So let's examine the last third of this movie, shall we? Because that's when our protagonist, Dr. Mindy, decides to bow out of the president's and Isherwell's plan and
choose the good choice.
The comet has now gotten close enough to be visible to the naked eye, and he rejoins Kate and Dr. Oglethorpe on a viral marketing campaign telling people to, quote, just look up. The president polarizes this by launching her own slogan, don't look up, and all of this suggests that the crux of the problem is that people in power are denying that there's a comet at all, which hasn't been true for the whole of the movie. The president never denied there was a comet. The media, except for the Fox News stand-in, of course, never denied that there was a comet. They just simply chose not to deal with the implications.
I say we sit tight and assess.
Until the president found it convenient, at which point she had a 99.1% approval rating. And even when she shifts to the Isherwell plan, that plan relies upon the existence of the comet. Like, we're for the jobs the comet will bring is a joke predicated on the existence of the comet. And yeah, maybe you could offer some leniency by saying that Don't Look Up is about denying that the comet is actually an existential threat, which would be more in tune with both the film's metaphor and the real-life shift in climate denialism, but then there's this guy. One moment's glance beyond the brim of his not a MAGA hat, and he realizes he's been duped. But he hasn't. Like, the crowd that immediately and inexplicably turned against the president hasn't. She never said there wasn't a comet. But more to the point, the just in Dr. Mindy and Kate's Just Look Up is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Just look up and then what? Exactly. Be terrified, scream, cry, have an orgy, get drunk and talk shit. What? Like, diagnosing a problem is not the same as solving it. And this has been an actual difficulty in communicating about climate change because unless you can point people toward actions they can take, all you end up doing is inducing panic and despair. And yeah, maybe the destruction of the entire planet isn't supposed to be fun. But working together to prevent that outcome could actually contain joy and hope and empowerment, community and satisfaction. You know, things that motivate people. And I'm not talking about individual solutions to systemic problems, like we're not going to recycle our way out of this. I hope you know that by now. No, I'm talking about collective activism in the form of general strikes and even, God forbid, direct action involving the destruction of corporate property. And hey, maybe there's a reason that those types of actions don't get advocated for in large-scale media outlets. Like, I can't even advocate for them here because they are, by definition, illegal. Like, I'm all for protests, obviously, but the film's imagination is limited in much the same way that most white-led activist spaces are, by the insistence on this defanged form of protest within the bounds of the law, whose goal is to pressure people whose power has already been systematically decoupled from the will of the people. And to a certain extent, this problem is justified by the movie's metaphor, which is bad. When it comes to climate change, you can destroy oil pipelines or disrupt the system in various ways, because climate change is a problem that has actual villains, like giant fossil fuel companies and car manufacturers and corporations dedicated to the idea of never-ending growth, none of whom have an avatar in this film because there's no CEO of Big Comet. When it comes to a comet, you do kind of have to rely on people with access to space shuttles and nukes. You don't have to navigate the complicated politics of fundamentally overhauling the world's energy systems. And even so, the Americocentrism makes it fairly pathetic that the last-ditch effort put forth by our heroes is to organize a concert to plead for the leaders of other nations to act. Like, why weren't you organizing globally before? And what, if any, impact did your actions have? Like, again, our heroes are told of the existence of the joint plan by Russia, India, and China in the same line of dialogue that informs them that it failed. Like, I'm sorry, I cannot get over this. Nominated for Best Original Screenplay. Their whole operation, their big concert, all that grassroots energy and effort, and the one stated goal is to convince other nations to do something. And 3 of the largest nations in the world join forces to do something, and they have no idea, no clue. Like, it really reads as though this line was just thrown in there to cover up the fact that they forgot to mention the joint mission earlier, but that just demonstrates how disinterested the film is in questioning the actual goals of their activism. Like, to what end isn't really important when the dire warning that the film wants to present us with relies upon them failing, right? So it's fine that we get nothing but cookie-cutter, platitude-filled, self-satisfied pageantry. What matters is that it looks like they're taking action. You get the idea, you know, just wave the camera vaguely in the direction of protest, and that will serve. So when Kate sits at the dinner table and says, "Well, we tried," it could genuinely be an incisive joke. Like, it could be devastatingly good comedy, showing how the good choice can be equally ineffectual. But alas, no. No, Dr. Oglethorpe steps up to reiterate the point by saying, "Man, oh man, did we try." And they all die horribly. But at least they knew they were right. Because this movie has no critique of power or systems. It has nothing to offer but telling us who the bad people are and assuring us that we're the good people. And that can be cathartic, like, it can be validating. Certainly a number of climate scientists, activists, and concerned citizens felt that way about the film. Because that's what polemic can do. It can create a sense of belonging around a shared, often negative belief. Honestly, that's what this essay has been. If you didn't like this movie, welcome to my world.
Like and subscribe.
But the nice thing about talking about art is that while it is an essential part of how humans interact with and connect with the world, it doesn't have the same sort of direct material impact as, say, the politics around climate change. Like, if you did like this movie, we can agree to disagree and nobody needs to be the bad guy. But this movie occupies the space of art while also demanding to be treated as political truth-telling. The filmmakers have taken the position that if you didn't like the movie, you're a character in the movie and not one of the good guys. It's a trap akin to shitposting and then mocking people who take you seriously, which can potentially be fine and harmless fun, but it's not politically persuasive and it's not activism. But then the movie and the filmmakers have no intention of being persuasive. At the same time that their conception of activism is limited to pressuring people in power, they show nothing but contempt for the type of communication that could make those people listen. And their utter disregard for how and why people change their minds and are mobilized to action is exemplified in the behavior of the crowds in the movie. So throughout the movie, we see random people in crowds suddenly and bizarrely changing their behavior, like taking note of Kate telling her boyfriend about the comet on the street, immediately starting a riot because Kate just stands up and tells a bar full of people the truth. Everyone getting out of their cars to silently stare at the comet when Dr. Mindy stops traffic. And then there's this guy again. There is a huge emotional and psychological gap between this guy seeing the truth of the comet and him recognizing and accepting that he's been conned. This is something that con artists and cults and conspiracy theories all rely on so that the lie they're selling can be adapted to accommodate new realities. Like, did January 6th make Trump supporters suddenly wake up and smell the fascism? No. There was a brief moment of shock and horror while the propaganda machine figured out their new angle. It was deep state and Antifa cosplayers, and also it was just a tourist visit, and also it was just a few bad apples. Whatever works for you. And once they did that, that was enough, as flimsy and self-contradictory as it may seem from the outside. But the reality of that psychology is too inconvenient a hurdle for the ideology behind this film to deal with. If you tell the truth, people will believe you and they'll act on that belief. Trying to mitigate the harshness of the truth in order for people to be open to it is as despicable as outright lying. It's a simplistic false binary, and it results in a movie built on straw man and facile metaphors. And to me, that makes it bad satire. And again, what I mean by that is that it's poorly observed. This movie and the problems it points to bear very little resemblance to the problems facing us regarding climate change. Like, there are certainly plenty of issues with how our news media ecosystem is incentivized, but the biggest hurdles to tackling climate change aren't bad journalism, slutty women, social media, or the spectacle of celebrity relationships. They're just not. I'm not saying that they're not a part of the picture. Well, not the sluts. I mean, maybe I'm being self-defensive here, but I really don't think you can pin this one on us. But it's a distortion of the subject, not an illumination of it, to place so much focus on them. Even the call to action that the creator spearheaded in the aftermath of the film's popularity is to fund climate journalism, which, in theory, is a good thing, but it assumes that the only thing standing in the way is a lack of truth-telling. And it likewise presumes that the audience for that journalism will not be limited by the polarization around that film. Or at least, if it is, it doesn't matter, because the only people I can possibly ostracize are people that aren't worth my time. So, yeah, that's my opinion. And yes, I think I'm right, because I'm me, and that's how opinions work. But even if it were what I consider good satire, even if it were remade accounting for all the critiques that I have, it wouldn't fundamentally change the politics of climate change, because that's not what satire does. We would still be having a conversation about the film and how meaning is constructed within it. Like, if we were discussing climate change, it would only be in reference to the film, like how well it does or doesn't reflect the reality we face. We wouldn't be having a conversation about what we can do to stop the apocalypse. And so when a certain creator of this film takes trollish delight in the online conversation about it and how he believes that the detractors are only revealing themselves to be part of the problem, he's chiding people for behaving the way they were always going to behave. And if the only way that you can conceptualize people's behavior that you disapprove of is by saying that they're just bad people, then you're not great at understanding people and you're gonna make bad art. And when you're celebrating the win of a climate change movie beating out Emily in Paris on Netflix or getting nominated for 4 Academy Awards, you are yourself ascribing material meaning to a symbolic victory. Even documentary filmmaking, such as An Inconvenient Truth, can only really achieve the end of raising awareness. And to that end, it did a far better job than this movie. Yet, I don't think that the Oscar it won fundamentally helped the situation. Like, if anything, it further polarized the issue, right? So, if you felt seen and validated by this movie, I'm happy for you. Enjoy the catharsis that art can provide. I wish I could have experienced it with you. It doesn't mean much apart from that. And if you didn't like this movie, there are 1,000 reasons why that may be. Like, maybe I touched on one of them. It doesn't mean much apart from that. And if you think that climate change is an existential threat to humanity and you're situated to do so, look up activist organizations where you live and get involved, because that says way more about your politics than whether or not you liked this movie. Okay, bye.